Hello chess fans! Today we're back with another over-the-board analysis, and today I'm going to analyze a game I played at a recent tournament against a national master that I have played many times before. I decided to start off the game with knight f3 just because I wanted to keep sort of flexible. I didn't know exactly what my opponent was going to go for, but knight f6, c4, they went for e6. So we've already had this a few other times. Here I went for g3. The idea is just to fianchetto the bishop and then castle, and typically the bishop does pretty good on this diagonal. Here my opponent went for d5, and now I went for bishop g2. And now there's a lot of different ways that you can play this. So the first way you can play it is just take the pawn, because there's nothing defending the pawn, and white can win it back immediately with queen a4 with a fork. But okay, white really ideally doesn't want to get their queen out. Now the other way you can do things is with bishop e7, which is just sort of the solid way to play. You go c6 after, and you sort of just play semi-Slav-like position. But the third way to play, which is what my opponent went for, is d4. And we've actually had this position 2 times before. And one of those times I won the game, and that was a rapid game. But the other time we just played a classical game the previous week to this game, and I actually blundered very quickly. So in both those games, I played this move e3. Now previously my opponent had played c5, and we got some complex position where I was slightly worse out of the opening. But yeah, c5 is definitely the most common move. It may not be the best move, actually, because what my opponent played is what they also played last week, which is a very, very trendy move. Now here previously, I'd played this move d3. And take a few seconds to see if you can find why d3 is a terrible move. I didn't know this opening whatsoever. I was sort of just making it up as I go. But here my opponent plays bishop b4. Now notice if I block with the knight or the bishop, my opponent's going to take here, and then the d3 pawn hangs. So for example, if I go here, now the d3 pawn is hanging, and if I get the bishop out of the way, now there's 2 attackers, and I have to take this pawn back. So that would be just completely losing. So in that game, I had to go king e2. And in all honesty, I got absolutely smashed that game. That game was not very close whatsoever. Okay. So instead of that, now I learned my lesson and I went for castles. And here my opponent went for the best move, which is e5. And here again I thought. So actually before this game I hadn't done any prep on this position. We sort of didn't really have that much time to prep. And I also thought my opponent wouldn't go for this. So what I was looking at was, again, I thought my opponent would go back to c5 because we just played a game in this. But okay, anyways, my opponent repeated it. So in the previous game I didn't go for this position because I was scared of after e takes, my opponent had this move e4. And e4 is a really, really scary move. So the idea is that you just want to take back with a knight, but the question arises, okay, why don't you just go knight g5 now? Aren't you attacking here? If he takes with a knight, then you can take here. Well, that actually doesn't matter, and I saw this, takes, and here black has this really surprising move, h5, and believe it or not here, black is actually completely equal. And I saw this position in the game, and I was just terrified, so I really did not want to go for this, and I wasn't also sure if my opponent had prepped this at all. This looks like a really... it looks very much in the style of my opponent. To just sack a pawn, you have this very, very nice outpost. You have these active pieces that can try to attack my king. You can probably castle queenside, and I'm undeveloped. This was really not the type of position I wanted to play in this game. I sort of wanted to get a small edge. So I went for d3 instead, which prevents this e4 idea and sort of leaves black asking, well, how do you make any sort of active moves? You just have to develop the bishop. And here the most common move is to go bishop c5. And my opponent actually didn't end up going for this. And I think the reason why is because after takes, my opponent really wanted to take with the pawn. And that's really what you're usually supposed to do. But here apparently after takes after the pawn, rook e1, there's no way to block the check other than to go bishop e6, which runs into knight g5, and then I win the pawn. Or bishop e7, and then you just wasted a move going bishop c5. So you obviously don't want to take with the pawn, but here the best move is knight takes d4. It's a difficult move to play because wasn't your knight just defending the e5 pawn? That is true. After knight takes e5, castles, here apparently the position is again completely equal. It shows you really the power of the knight on d4 and the backwards pawn, like how bad the backwards pawn can be. Not to mention that after I go knight f3, I'm immediately going to get forked, and then he can even go knight d7 and knight e5 again to put more pressure, pinned, to put more pressure on the pin. So this would not be great for me. So, yeah, so that would, if he sacked that pawn, it wouldn't be great. But instead of that, he went for bishop e7, which is the logical move. Now after takes, which is what I played in the game, takes, well, there's no rook e1 check. So, okay, so here's very difficult. So you don't really know where you want to put your pieces. The bishop could go to f4. The bishop probably doesn't want to go to g5 because then I don't really want to take the knight. So where could the bishop go? I'm not really sure. Where does the knight go? It's hard to say. Like, it could go to e4, but then, there's always a bishop on f5. Okay, how about if I put the knight on c2 so that I can guard b4? How do I put the knight on c2? I go knight a3. And that's why this move took me about 10 minutes to find. And it's pretty much the only sort of logical move that has a plan. Like rook e1 there would seem like a logical move, but there's no plan. There's no second move to rook e1. So here my opponent decided to castle, which is definitely the most natural move. Here I went knight c2, continuing with my plan. I want to go b4 now. And right now b4 is not necessarily a threat, but it will be a threat in the future. So my opponent always has to play this move a5. Not to mention that if they dilly-dally too much, I can go a3, rook b1, and b4 immediately. So a5 right away, preventing b4. And here I decided to play another move, which is a little bit more advanced, but it's sort of the idea is you have to have a plan in every position. And if you don't have a plan, then there's just nothing you can do. So don't play slight improving moves like rook e1 or bishop d2. These moves are not very good because they don't have a consistent idea. I decided to play the move b3. So, okay, my idea was to go b4. He stopped the idea b4. Can I still go for b4? Yes, because he hasn't had a pawn on c5. That's the whole idea. You play against this knight on c6. Now, what if I go a3? Well, then he goes b3 or a4, and the problem is I can't go b4 because he takes on b3. And that usually sometimes isn't a problem because you can go rook b1 and take back, but I really don't like how he has a lot of pressure on this pawn. And it'll sort of keep at least some of my pieces tied down to it, whether it be the bishop or the rook on b3, so I don't want to allow this. So there's this common idea to go b3 first. That way, now, if he goes a4, then I can just go rook b1 and push b4 next. And if he goes bishop f5 as he did in the game, I can go a3. Now, I wanted to mention here, actually, my opponent had incredible knowledge of this position. They actually mentioned here that they saw a Magnus Carlsen game from this position, like this exact position that they remembered, and they were following that game. And actually, bishop f5 was the move that was played by Magnus. So Magnus was playing black here. And in that game, after rook e1, queen d7, bishop b2, attacking this pawn here, Magnus went bishop c5, and after knight e5 takes bishop d6, rook e1, c5. Here, Magnus was winning. And Magnus actually went on to win that game because of the fact that this c5 pawn is just absolutely anchoring black's queenside. And these two pieces are absolutely horrible. An attack quickly came through, and Magnus managed to convert this. So instead of that, I didn't go for rook e1 with knight e5 right away, but instead I went a3. And my idea is, okay, I can pretty much play rook e1 whenever, but it doesn't have any immediate threat. So why don't I try to immediately go rook b1 and b4? That's my immediate idea. And then after b5, this pawn would hang. So a3 is technically the second best move according to the engine by 0.1, but I think practically it's much more logical than the move that Magnus' opponent played. And here my opponent immediately went rook a6. Now rook a6 looks very, very, very strange, and it's a very creative idea, but it's actually quite a smart move because my opponent saw that, okay, if I go rook b1, there's pretty much no way he can stop b4 unless he brings his rook to b6 to stop b4. So it's a very creative idea, and also the rook can sometimes swing across to the king side, though that's not so much of an idea. The main idea is to prevent b4. I continue with my plan because I don't think the rook on b6 is great. So rook b6. There's a reason why you don't see people doing this usually, but in this specific position, it's not so bad. And now I went rook e1. So I saw, okay, I don't have b4 anymore. Well, what do I want to do next? Well, this rook is kind of misplaced, so let's just, continue developing. And here my opponent went bishop c5. So this is sort of the idea that he used from Magnus. He remembered that he went bishop e7 first and then bishop c5 later. But here I'm not even attacking the pawn, so it's a little bit less good. And now here I actually played the best move, and it was like the same idea from that Magnus game, but I didn't even recognize the idea. And I think after the game I thought I made a mistake. But here I played the move knight e5, and the idea is that if my rook takes on e5, then there's just going to be a fork. And if not, I'm going to take on c6 and ruin my opponent's structure, and this bishop on c5 is misplaced. Sometimes in this type of position, there's the idea to go knight d7, knight c5. Obviously, you can't go knight d7 right now because I take on d4. But when the bishop is on c5, you especially can't go knight d7 because there's no knight c5 square. So that was another idea. And yeah, if I give my opponent too much time, like to go knight d7 right after or to go rook e8 and prevent knight e5, then my pieces are kind of jumbled. I have less space here, so I want to trade pieces, but also my opponent has some weaknesses in the position, and their pieces are also a little bit jumbled and passive defending these weaknesses. So here my opponent went for rook e8, and now I took on c6, my opponent took on e1, and I went queen e1 here, and here I played what I think is the best move. So actually here, I think my opponent should have just taken right away, and we're going to see why, because when the queen is on e1, actually, it's attacking the a5 pawn, and that's a5 pawn is no longer defended. So after it takes, take a few seconds to see if you can find the best move for white. So yeah, pause the video if you didn't see it. It's a very logical move. It's not queen takes a5, because then bishop takes d3 attacks this pawn, and if I defend, then he can move his bishop wherever, and this d pawn becomes very, very dangerous. So no need to give your opponent any counterplay. How do I defend this pawn? Not with this knight, not with this rook, not with this bishop, but with this bishop, bishop f1. And I think this was the move my opponent missed, actually, in this position, when they initially went for rook e1. And with the bishop defending this pawn, there's no way to defend the a5 pawn. And you might say, wait, why can't I just move my queen? Because then the queen comes to e5 and there's this fork. Same idea as before. That's why bishop c5 was not such a great move. So they eventually all connected. So my opponent went knight d7. It's very difficult to find a move. Already, maybe they should just move the bishop back. But obviously, you don't want to move the bishop to c5 and then back. So I think knight d7 is a very human move. I just took the pawn. My opponent went with their bishop back. So here I'm threatening the move b4 and then to capture the bishop. So that was needed. Here we went queen e1. Queen e1 was maybe not necessary, but it's a very, very human move. The idea is I want to go b4, but I don't want my queen to be trapped on the queen side. So I went queen e1. And here they went f6. The idea is, okay, for one, they're allowing knight e5 so that they can put more pressure here. For two, they're creating another square for the bishop. Sometimes they're also defending the pawn to go to g5. It's very difficult. So here my opponent's threatening knight e5. I don't want them to go knight e5, so I went bishop f4. They went bishop f7, threatening g5. And yeah, here I went for pretty much the most straightforward way to win the game, which is b4, g5. And here I spent a long time. Pause the video. There are many, many different winning moves here. You can even go bishop back. That is also winning. But you should always try and look for the simplest move that can win the game. And you could also take here and trade these. That's another way. But the simplest move to win the game is bishop takes c7. Attacking the queen. Takes here, attacking the rook. So he has to trade rooks. And then after knight takes, here we have knight takes d4. And we're now just up 2 pawns. Not just 1 pawn, but 2 pawns here. And yeah, the game ended not too difficult from here. So my opponent went bishop g6. And here actually I played a very, very nice move. So here, Black's idea is they're going to keep your queen tied down to defending this, and they're going to attack this next, the knight and the pawn behind it next, and this was going to be very, very difficult to defend all your weaknesses. Now, you might just want to push the pawn right away, but how would you do that, and what should you do? So yeah, pause the video. This is a really nice move, and the move is queen b4. And it's actually funny to note that here, the problem with Black's position is actually that they have too weak a king. My opponent played knight takes d3. But pretty much, okay, if they defend the knight, then I just attack the pinned piece and then trade queens. That's an easy win. If they move the knight back, then like either of these squares, any of these squares, the same thing that happened in the game happens. And obviously the most natural move then is just to take here. So that's what they did. Takes. They took here with the bishop. And now I have this move, knight e6. Threatening the queen, also threatening queen f8 checkmate. So what if they go back? Then I go queen here, and there's no way to stop checkmate other than to sacrifice the queen. So Black's king is actually the one that's weakened by this f6 and g5 push. And I also, by doing this, I managed to trade off all the pieces. So my opponent went c5. I just took on c7. I think even if taking on c7 was not the best move, I probably would have gone for it, because just keeping queens on the board, there's probably no need. I mean, actually, even this, he still gets mated. So yeah, I mean, maybe this was better. Oh, no, but this is what I was worried about. Yeah, he has bishop takes c4. So knight takes here, takes. And funnily enough here, Black cannot take this pawn, because after here, there's no way to stop the pawn from promoting. Think about like bishop here. Wait, why can't he do this? Oh, yeah, because I go here. And then if he goes bishop here, then I go f3. And there's just no way to get your bishop on the right diagonal. And this knight is covering the a6 square, so the bishop can't come here. Knight also covers this d5 square, and this is the square of the pawn. The king can't get inside of it, so this would be a nice win. My opponent went king f7. And again, my opponent's king is not in the square of the pawn. Or I guess the king can get into the square of the pawn, but then I go knight d5. And yeah, in this position, if he goes king d6, then I can go here. Because if he goes here, now I promote. And then if he stops me, then I have this fork, which would end the game. So instead of that, my opponent went king e6, seeing that, okay, this b6, but then I just went b6 anyways. And there's no way to get back. And yeah, in this position, my opponent resigned. So yeah, this was the game that allowed me to get over 2,300 for the first time. I think I went up to 2320 after this tournament, and it also allowed me to win the tournament, so great game. And yeah, I think it was pretty instructive about some ideas in the modern Benoni. But then again, I don't think my opponent played their best game. For example, this move bishop c5 was pretty poor. And yeah, following that Magnus game, while it may have looked to be a good idea, and my opponent definitely knew the position more than me, surprisingly. I think following the Magnus game, when apparently Magnus was not playing great moves, is a little bit sad, because usually you'd expect if you remember a Magnus game and you play the same moves as Magnus, then you're gonna get a good position. But turns out that already after this position, After this position, the position is plus 0.5, and it's not just that, it's also very, very pleasant for white to play. Like, I don't think anything I did was too crazy. All I did was just continue with the natural plans, and it's very difficult for black to do anything unless white forces their hand. So yeah, that's in today's video, guys. If you liked the video, please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.